call is now being recorded.
Okay, so I'm here with Kim. I found her on a toxic mold group, and she has a very interesting story to share. She claims to have healed from mitral valve regurgitation, which from my understanding and through my research, I found that it seems to be incurable. So this is a very interesting story. So Kim, could you tell us like your background story and when did all your health problems start? Stuff like that.
That's going to make for a long background story, Christian, but it's a good point. I should bring that up. So for me, my health problems started fairly early. When I was 4 years old, I started developing migraines, and then the next symptom I recall is anxiety that just grew and grew and grew. Eventually, the symptoms just began adding on top of one another. I had muscle aches and joint pain that my poor mother, she really thought they were growing pains. So she would tell me that they would go away, but they never went away. When I got older, I finally was told that would be called fibromyalgia. But for me, it actually started in childhood, which was kind of an interesting thing, looking back. I developed an autoimmune disease at 16. My mother also developed an autoimmune disease around that age as well, a different one. So these things weren't viewed as odd in my family. Strange as it may sound, to have all of these things compound. At 12, I started developing really extreme gastrointestinal pain, which later I'd be told.
Let me interrupt you for a second.
Sure.
Would you mind sharing which autoimmune disease it was?
You know what? It's a skin autoimmune disease, and I'll just leave it at that. They're kind of a little grouping of skin autoimmune diseases that affect the skin. And so,
okay.
So either way, I just kept having things happen. So let's see, the gut stuff really started when I was about 12, and all this time I was very achy, very migraine prone, of course. I had what's called MCS. I didn't know this at the time, but the migraines were triggered any time I was around a perfume, gasoline, paint, and any sort of odorific thing. And eventually that even included essential oils and flowers and such. But originally it just started with things that were from petrochemicals, for example. So I kept having all of these problems and just kind of getting more and more symptoms. But I had always been kind of a kid who wasn't very strong, who was really a really slim build. My dad's were really tall and slim, and I grew very tall and slim, as is my sister. When I was in my 20s, I started getting a lot worse, though. Really went downhill. Extreme back pain and chest pain that developed that just was very, very intense. The chest and back pain was so extreme. I saw different doctors for it, but eventually settled on a naturopath who tried to help me, but really didn't understand that I was a zebra and not a horse. I don't know if you have heard that saying, but she would tell me things, and I'd say, something is wrong. And she would say, in medicine we're trained to think horses when we hear hoofbeats, not zebras. Well, I was a zebra sitting in her office, and so unfortunately, she eventually came to believe that I was a hypochondriac. So
I've been there. That's happened to me.
Oh my goodness, it's incredible how that can happen and how disheartening that is. And
yeah,
so I
is.
just had these layers upon layers of problems. I didn't realize I also had extreme food sensitivities to most of the foods I was eating. And when you're food sensitive to most of the things you're eating, you can't tell it all because you have eaten something every single meal that irritates your gut. So you're just constantly in a state of irritation. But
what were you eating that you were sensitive to?
You know, it was such a long list. Once I finally figured it out, I used the technique of elimination and then testing with a food family 4-day rotation. This is called a rotary diversified diet, and with allergy elimination and testing. And so in the end, I mean, goodness sakes, it was easier to state what I wasn't sensitized to. Really, that was a simpler list. I mean, almost every grain, except in the cereal grass family, except for millet and wild rice. So, you know, corn, wheat, rice, rye, barley, oats. Many vegetables, lettuce and carrots and apples and pears, and I just couldn't. Almost all the common things I'd eaten, I developed a sensitivity to. So it was very extreme, but I didn't know it at that time. Now, I think here's a key factor, though. When I was so to kind of take me back to age 4, I lived in a moldy house. We didn't know it was moldy, but it was very water damaged. We had pots and pans out some years to catch in the winter, to catch water that would drip down into the living room. So there was a severe problem there. The house also had a small spring underneath it, so it had a constant source of water underneath the house. So we moved at a certain point in that time. We moved to another house that I later found out is moldy. My parents still live there, and so I'm able to discern that. And then at 23, I moved back into my childhood moldy home, the one where I had developed most of these problems. My health crashed after that. And so at 22, I moved in there. By 23, I stopped producing stomach acid. And that was something that this naturopath figured out. But I think that's kind of a key to my story. That was the start of really severe digestive and problems and malnutrition, essentially. Functional malnutrition, where I ate really well. I ate organic foods. I ate a variety of foods, but not only was I producing no stomach acid anymore, but I also was not I didn't know that I had all these food sensitivities. So I was eating things I was sensitized to, and if you eat things you're sensitized to, you can't digest them very well at all, and you're not getting much nutrition from them. They're too aggravating to the gut. So let's see. So my health really crashed at that point, and this, to stop producing stomach acid at 23 is highly unusual. But unfortunately, for some reason, this doctor
or at any age, pretty much, right?
Unusual. It's considered kind of a normal thing for stomach acid production to lower when you get older, but it really shouldn't disappear. I think that I would agree with what you said, Christian, that at any age. But if you were to ask a doctor, they'd say, as people get older, that's what happens. But in my case, and this is a little gross, but how I realized something was weird was that I had always been prone, I thought, to food poisoning. Now, I don't know if I was prone to food poisoning or if I just would eat too much of a food I was sensitized to and I would get very, very sick and throw up. But at 23, when I threw up, when I would get these bouts of this illness, there was no stomach acid. The food that came up had, basically was just like it was going down. And so that was interesting. Yeah, and so there literally was none. And if you know when you're a kid and unfortunately you end up vomiting, there's usually a horrible burning sensation in the back of your throat. And if you did that too much, you would really harm your teeth and your throat. But that stopped. That problem, in quotes, stopped for me when I moved back to that moldy house. So it really harmed my digestive system being back in there. So then all these back problems really kept happening, this intense chest pain started developing. And I couldn't tell if it was chest, stomach, or gut. They kind of all wrapped together. At about that time also, my intestines just became really hard, and like to press on my stomach, it was very, very firm, even though I didn't have very strong stomach muscles. So
this reminds me a lot of the GAPS diet, like the stuff from the book.
Thank heavens that's what ended up healing me digestively. And so so when I got to I didn't know about that then, though. That was the sad part. I really didn't know, and I did not believe that I could possibly be allergic to anything, although I thought that maybe it was a possibility. I mean, it didn't make any, I had no indication of it, I should say. To her credit, this naturopath put me on a small, not very scientific elimination diet, which is a common one that many doctors do, where they just have you eliminate the most common allergens. So I was allowed to eat rice, but not any gluten-containing grains or corn, and took out yeasts and any yeast-containing things, took out just all the most common allergens. The only one that I knew that I was sensitized to was dairy. I did know that, and I'd figured that out at 18, and I'd stopped eating that. But the way that she did this, just taking out like 15 common allergens, it wasn't enough for me. I needed everything taken out in order to be able to see a result from it. I also did an allergy blood test, and that showed, interestingly, that I had zero sensitivities whatsoever. And I remember asking her, how can that be? I know I'm sensitive to dairy of any form, so I don't think it's lactose, because I was even sensitized to hard cheeses. And she said, well, I don't know, these aren't necessarily very accurate, and sometimes, your results were all so low. You have such a tiny immune response at all to these things. She said occasionally there's a disorder where a person's immune system is not working properly, and so they're actually sensitized to all of these things, but they're not able to, it doesn't really show up. And so I wish then that I would have pursued that, but she wasn't really interested in pursuing it, and so it just didn't happen, and I kind of let it go. So the really key
like pursuing that line of thought?
Yes. Like could I then possibly have been sensitized to all of those things? Because that was actually the case. I just didn't realize it.
Okay.
But
all right.
so then when I was 27 years old, things really started happening. I was getting a lot worse. I was just in chronic pain, and I had been for several years at that point. I had experienced chronic pain since I was little anyway, but this was chronic pain to the level, like on a scale of 1 to 10, a daily level of an 8 or a 9. And so I finally, I was on a short trip, and I got exposed to some natural gas, and it seems like it was a bit too much, because I ended up having a lung collapse. And so it's called a spontaneous pneumothorax when your lung collapses on its own. But this is what would lead to the discovery of the mitral valve regurgitation. So in that year when I was 27, I actually had 6 lung collapses. My left lung collapsed 6 times. And to explain, it's called a lung collapse even if it's a partial collapse. So even if your lung just collapses a little bit and the hole closes up again, and so your lung is not completely squished down to the size of like a small orange, it's still called a lung collapse. Those first 5 were partial lung collapses, and the first, until the 5th one, they were not discovered. Sometimes that can happen. They can be misdiagnosed rather easily. So I was misdiagnosed. Finally it was figured out, and I ended up, long story short with that, needing lung surgery to fix a hole in my left lung that ended up healing as a whole, and so my lung collapsed